All right, guys, today we're going to be talking about overexploitation, but first, a couple species of the day. I can't remember who turned this one in. I remember being amused at the unique photos, Oreo zebras and whatnot, but zebras, a group of zebras is called a zeal or a dazzle. They fight to start their own group of zebras, as we can see here in the bottom. Most of their diets are grass, leaves, twigs, herbs, shrubs. They also have a high demand for water in their diet. Another animal, ooh, I thought I had one more. Oh, it went backwards, was the white tiger. Again, there's links on here, but please click those at your own time. I'll include it in our Google Classroom posting. But here you can see the white tiger, a mix of a Bengal tiger mutation. It's sort of a rare mutation, but anywhere where Bengal tigers are found, you can find a white one. Inbreeding, intentional inbreeding in order to create white ones is a problem from animal breeders. Zip past zebra. And today our topic is overexploitation. By the way, this is the last lesson for our test number 2. And remember, our tests are not cumulative. So if you go back and look at the material since test number 1, this would be our last lesson that we're going to include. So, what is exploitation? One other word for exploitation is actually just use or consumption of animals used by humans. This can be fishing for food or sport, subsistence hunting, collecting for the exotic pet trade, killing for medicinal or cultural reasons. Any type of way that we use animals would be considered animal exploitation or animal use. Overexploitation is when we use more than can replenish themselves. So if a population can replenish 5 a year and we're using 5 a year, that would be considered just use exploitation. If we exceed that 5 per year, then we are overexploiting the resource and potentially reducing its ability to be successful in future years. So, we've mentioned Tragedy of the Commons before. This idea first came out in 1968. Back then, the example was sheep grazing. I think the scenario that was mentioned in this article was that a bunch of different farmers had their own land for their sheep to graze, but there was also common land that they could use. And what happened is people kept adding to the common land because why not? They can support more sheep that way, it's good for them. The problem, though, is no one took responsibility for the quality of that land because it was common, and in the end, that land was overexploited, did not provide resources for future years. It's often also an example in fishing. If everybody takes just what they need for fish, it might not be that bad, but if many groups or many fisher people are over exploiting those resources or trying to get more and more profit each time, they could get to the point where they are taking more fish from the sea than can replenish themselves. So the underlying idea here is that human populations grow, and we have common resources. We really need to be careful, make sure that we are utilizing all of those resources in a safe, replenishable way. So humans have a history of overexploitation, and we're going to talk about a few of those examples. One example, this one's kind of cool, was a sea cow, or a certain type of sea cow. So this looks similar to a manatee, but this was one in the eastern Bering Sea that ate kelp, so a saltwater sea cow. And this was the largest member. They can become 8 meters long, ladies and gentlemen. That's like 25 feet or more long. And very, very heavy, big, slow moving mammals. They were discovered in 1941 when a captain and his crew were shipwrecked on an uninhabited island. You can see how big it would be compared to the people. Again, uninhabited island, they're trying to survive, so they hunted this animal for meat and fat. About half of the crew survived and returned home where they had come from. 27 years later, this animal had become extinct. So it got discovered, utilized, and it impacted, overexploited the environment, and as a result, extinction. Another example, this one is pretty shocking, is these types of penguins here on Macquarie Island in the early 1900s were used to extract oil for oil lamps. It says that they boiled 3 million penguins in the early 1900s for oil, again, to keep lamps lit. Once oiling was stopped, only 4,000 remained. So imagine exploiting 3 million leaving only 4,000. Obviously, it would have a huge impact on the population, the genetic diversity, all the things. Fortunately, in this situation, they did make very large scale conservation efforts. Currently, or in recent years, the population has regenerated up to about 500,000 with a good genetic diversity. So we got lucky on that one. However, as people were there and conserving and also utilizing those resources, accidentally rats were exposed. Very successful invasive species. To control the rats in the area where rats aren't native, they brought cats. Cats did a great job of managing those rats, so rats didn't stay a problem. However, they also brought rabbits for food as they were doing that work. The cats have been removed, the rats have been removed, but now rabbits are out of control. So the overexploitation also led to continued damage from invasive species. According to the World Conservation Union, over 30% of endangered animals are due to overexploitation by human, and 8% of endangered plants. The same thing. Here you see elephant tusks. We have the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. This is the largest professional kind of conservation network, over 1,000 member organizations, 140 countries, more than 200 governments, and more than 800 non-government organizations. So thousands of voluntary scientists doing all types of field projects and activities around the world, funded in a whole bunch of different ways. But the cool work that they're doing is they're gathering all of the different research from all the different areas and groups and kind of ranking animals and plants as far as how at risk or threatened they might be. So we can see they have categories leading from least concerned, near threatened, vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, extinct in the wild, that means only in captivity do they exist, and then extinct. Animals or plant species are assigned to these categories based on the different criteria that they meet. If we say threatened, they could be anywhere in this category: a vulnerable species, endangered, or critically endangered. As you move up the list, it becomes more at risk or actually extinct already. So they look at a lot of different things when they're trying to figure out the criteria for how endangered or at risk a species is. It can be considered endangered if the population size has reduced by more than 70% in 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is longer. They look at places where, or situations where the reduction could be reversible, and they understand why the numbers are being reduced, and they could stop sort of the human overexploitation that's causing it. Something can also be considered endangered if the population size reduced by 50% in 10 years or 3 generations, where they have not stopped reducing, or we don't know why the population is reducing, or we might not be able to reverse it. For instance, complete habitat destruction might not be able to be reversed for specialist species. So the IUCN list is pretty comprehensive. We have over 70,000 species have been evaluated. However, when you look at the number of species on Earth, it really isn't comprehensive at all. About 15,000 new species are just discovered each year as being at risk and reported, and then that has to be researched further. So there's a lot of different categories, as we saw previously, when they're looking at different species and trying to figure out where they're at on this list. Data deficient basically means we don't know a lot about it. We don't have enough information for whether this species is at risk for extinction. Therefore, it's not really considered a threat. But if we learn more about that species, there's a chance that it could be moved into the threatened classification. Some species just aren't evaluated. In 1973, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species was formed with the intent to ensure international trade of species doesn't threaten their survival. We ask countries to join voluntarily, but basically the understanding is if a species is succeeding out in the wild but could be in danger, we're not going to remove that animal from the wild. And so that's a voluntary thing, but a good step in the right direction. This can help protect animals that otherwise might be exploited for profit, or zoos, or animal products as well, which we'll talk about. So you can see here that since 1975, we've had an increasing number of countries that have joined in this agreement to not trade in these endangered or at-risk animals. So the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, again, has about 5,000 species of animals and 29 species of plants that are protected. So these all go into three categories, but are not supposed to be sold or traded. So endangered or threatened, no trade at all. If they're not threatened with extinction, but there is a concern that they could be, if trade is not controlled, then international trade might be authorized depending on sort of the circumstance. Appendix 3 is basically if a country requests and needs cooperation from other countries, they can ask for assistance in protecting those animals. International trade might be allowed only if they have like the correct permits and certificates to help support that species. We have in the US, a lot of federal and state regulations as well. The US Fish and Wildlife Endangered Species Act both support animals that are threatened or endangered. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, specifically in our state, keeps a list of endangered, threatened, and sensitive species, and they're given extra consideration in all different aspects of human wildlife interaction, growth, building roads, ability to access areas, things like that. This is a western pond turtle. Cute little guy, lives up and down the west coast, as you can see here. Was considered vulnerable. However, it hasn't been kind of re-looked at or restudied since about 1996. So the IUCN says vulnerable, needs to update it. Our federal regulation says it's a species of concern. State regulations that are looking into it say it's endangered. So depending on the organization, you might see different rankings as well. And it's definitely important to note when that sort of assessment was last done, how accurate each one might be. Here you see rhinoceros tusks. We're going to talk a little bit about the global black market and wildlife exploitation. This would be a great topic. I bet we're going to have some papers on this one. The World Wildlife Fund estimates illegal trade produces at least $35 billion a year. We think that population growth of humans increasing also increases the demand for illegal trade of animals, both for food, for their meat, and as parts, like you see here, the horns. So I feel like we've looked at this image before. If not, sorry, I remember it somehow. But we can see the bear and the different prices of different body parts on different markets. And we can see, for instance, that Japan will pay a high price for different bear parts, whereas Vietnam is number 2. South Korea is number 3. So we have these Asian countries interested in bear. Rhinoceros, just in the world, can be $100,000 per kilogram for the rhinoceros horn. Ivory, you can see the countries that are interested in that. China being up there, Thailand being up there as well. And then tiger, raw bone is a big one in China. Also bone gel, raw bone of leopards. We'll talk a little bit about why those are so important. But basically, we have a global black market for a variety of reasons. Prices are skyrocketing. Terrorists have begun to control these wildlife goods to try to fund their terrorist organizations like Boko Haram and Al Shabaab. Lizard skins is a big one. The water monitor lizard is the most heavily exploited lizard in the world. Up to 1.5 million lizards were taken from Indonesia for the leather industry in 1990 alone. So as our population has grown, that demand has only increased. Here you can see images of water monitor lizard skin kind of being stretched and dried. All of these animals are wild caught. They are not raised for this purpose. And as a result, local populations are being decreased from overhunting. Overall population trends aren't known, but we can assume that they are decreasing due to an increased need in wild caught monitor lizard skin. So Next, we've got the wildlife used for medicinal purposes. Bear was really high on that list we just looked at. It's used in traditional Chinese medicine, supposed to be good at curing gallstones, liver problems, heart disease, and many other things. So that demand for bear was mentioned there. YouTube video below if you want to take a look at that and how bear is used in these purposes. And again, you can see here, bear, there's a lot of different things. The gallbladder, bile flakes, bile powder, raw bile are all supposed to be good medicinal things. So the urideoxyalcoholic acid in bear bile may have benefits for antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, anti-tumor, anti-convulsant, and many other things. This use of bear for these purposes threatens their populations all over the world. Many different types of bears are illegally caught for this purpose. You can see prices have skyrocketed, as mentioned before. 1970, it was about $200 per kilo. 2009, it could go up to $50,000 per kilo. 1980s, bear farming actually became a thing in order to extract bile from living bears, kind of torturous. We've tried to decrease that practice. There's also a lot of fake products. Obviously, if something can sell at very high prices, people are going to make frauds and fake prices as well. That can actually shoot up the price of real stuff. So another issue. But the goal is to decrease the demand for wild bear products and protect wild bears. Some articles here about biofarming ending in Vietnam. One that we've all heard of, I think, is trade in rhino horns. Since 1970, 90% of the world's rhinos are gone from our planet. The horns are supposedly used for medicinal purposes and for status. And as you can see, people come and savagely cut the horns off the rhinos and leave the rhinos dead or dying. So one solution that have been tried in different parks is to kind of file down the rhino horn to prevent poachers from getting it. There are some problems that come with this, though. First of all, it's expensive to dehorn a rhino. Poachers sometimes shoot from far away. They might shoot and kill a rhino before they even realize it doesn't have a horn. And some poachers will still kill it for the remaining bit of horn, because rhino horns are kind of like our hair or nails. They continue to grow, so shaving it down does not mean there is no horn there. Depending on the length of time since that happened, there can be a good amount of horn still available. And some poachers will get angry and just kill it so they don't have to waste energy tracking that rhino again, because that rhino is no good to them. So there's negative effects to the health of the rhino, having to immobilize it and remove the horn. And it also decreases the rhino value for ecotourists and things like that. But in some cases, it can, but doesn't always help save the life of that rhino. Here we see the percentage of number of rhinos that have been observed in a given year. They were extinct from Kruger National Park by 1936 due to poaching. They were reintroduced in 1971 and protected. And what we are seeing is an upward trend. We are seeing technically more rhinos over the time, and percent of landscapes with rhinos improving. But it is a never-ending battle to protect those rhinos from poachers and keep poachers out of these parks. Animal trophies are also a big controversial issue as well. Here we can see an article from October 2014 where Australia banned the import of lion trophies. So Australians going to hunt for trophy animals weren't allowed to bring them home from South Africa. Elephant poaching, another big issue. Videos here about ivory and poaching. Might be one of our documentaries that we watch, actually. I have one on poaching. Lots of examples of that in the news. Another aspect of overexploitation is commercial hunting and fishing, where there's an exchange of money to go out and hunt for trophy animals, trophy fish. That's sort of the industrialized type. Licensed hunting, you can go and get a license to fish salmon, and you're given a certain legal number that you're allowed to take. poaching of the salmon, for instance, would be an illegal take if you are taking more than you're supposed to, or types of animals or parts of animals and wasting other parts of animals. That's all under that illegal overexploitation. So we can see that there's tons and tons of fish taken from our ocean every year. These are actually millions of tons of fish. China is the number one fishing country in the world. But when you add it all up, we are talking about 90 million tons of fish consumed per year by our growing human population. Obviously, that's going to have an impact to our fishing populations. Here is a cool video you can watch about the Goliath tigerfish. This is a terrifying fish. Happy to hear that it has not invaded other areas other than that region you can see in Africa. Shark fishing is a good example of humans overexploiting a resource. Overfishing and removing of sharks along the eastern United States has huge impacts. One of the biggest ones was a significant loss of scallops. Well, why would removing a top predatory shark cause a loss of scallops? Probably what you would assume. If there aren't sharks, they aren't eating they aren't being the predator fish controlling the other predators that would eat scallops. So sharks do a good job of controlling ray populations, skates, and smaller sharks. Smaller sharks, and those animals will eat fish. Fish will eat the scallops. So if you don't have that keystone species controlling the populations that are eating those scallops, they saw a boom in the number of those smaller fish and a loss of scallops along the coast. So in Africa, bushmeat the forest is called the bush. Any meat that comes from an animal living in the forest is called bushmeat. It's a multi-billion-dollar per year industry in Africa. What we're seeing, though, is that as the human African population is growing, poverty and food security are growing as well. So there's a large demand for bushmeat, both for survival for people and also for them to sell to make money for other resources. The government doesn't have a very easy way of enforcing that, and so studies are showing that bushmeat is dramatically the animals that turn into the bushmeat populations are dramatically decreasing as well. It's actually a bigger problem than elephant poaching in Kenya these days, the reduction of animals and diversity in the forests. So to protect that, they've made hunting of any wild animals illegal in Kenya. Do you think this is going to help? Well, if populations are growing and people are hungry, I'm going to guess not so much. They're just quieter about it. Here's the Indri. Cool little animal there, lives in Madagascar. Remember what we learned about last time? Islands can be dangerous places because there's not a lot of places to move. These guys have decreasing populations due to habitat loss. Now, what was protecting them for a very long time is it was taboo to kill these. Local people would not kill these animals. They were considered sort of sacred, and that protected them from people injuring them or killing them off. However, that taboo is so slowly going away as areas are being modernized. The traditional hunting is fading. There's a lot of immigrants coming in with different ideas who don't feel that same cultural protection of the injury. There's a greater demand for meat in general, and so also their skins are used for clothing. So all of a sudden they're being seen as a resource, not as something to be revered. How do you deal with that? That's a big challenge for conservationists. Is it ethical to reinforce that it's taboo to kill these animals in order to protect them? So that there's a lot of issues in conservation science and conservation biology about what is the right way, and in different communities and cultures there could be different solutions to that problem. So subsistence hunting is probably a term you've heard of before. This is hunting or fishing for food, enough to survive. Subsistence hunting is usually totally fine and works well in an ecological system when human numbers are small. However, as human populations grow, there's a demand for more resources, and that can cause a problem to the populations of animals being hunted. So reserves sometimes, which are supposed to be areas set aside to protect wildlife, end up being the only place people can find food. And when you're hunting for survival, you don't care as much about preserving animals when you're hungry. So scientists did a research on the effects of subsistence hunting in the Amazon. They looked at 25 different sites that had different pressure for subsistence farming. Some areas were not hunted at all, some were lightly hunted, some were heavily hunted. And they looked at the different biomass of animals and density of animals. So, what these charts show you is the different sizes of animals and how many there were. And so the game density, how many animals per square land mass, were going down in non hunted areas by age. This is the age of the animals. Lightly hunted areas, they actually did a little bit better. So that's interesting that lightly hunting can kind of manage a population. As they moderately hunted an area, though, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The numbers going down is as it time over time as it's not hunted, over time as it's lightly hunted, and we're seeing this being lower. Moderately hunted and then heavily hunted, we're seeing our populations diminish to almost nothing. They also looked at the biomass of the animals living in an area, and when they weren't hunting, what we saw was biomass maintain nice, healthy numbers. Lightly hunted, the different sized animals are separated here, but the overall biomass is pretty decent as well. Once you start moderately or heavily hunting, this is the problem. So these lightly hunted areas are what you would have seen in like a not very densely populated kind of traditional society before our human population boom. Moderately and heavy obviously make a much bigger impact to the creatures. Here's a lowland tapir. I can never say that one. I'm sorry. But what we found is with subsistence hunting and these growing populations, most large species have basically been eliminated because they're the slower ones and the easier ones to catch. Sea turtles is an example that's really struggled closer to home. This is the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. They 60% of all the nesting sites occurs in just one little 40-kilometer stretch of beach. And what they saw when they were looking at it is these animals typically have synchronized nesting, where tons and tons of females kind of arrive to the beach at the same time, and they all dig their nests and lay their eggs. Typical nest will have approximately 100 eggs in it. Historically, humans have exploited this fact. When they noticed all of the turtles coming onto the shore, they would go down and take those eggs for food. The local villagers would. In 1947, they saw 42,000 turtles laying their eggs in a single day. Okay, that's a lot. But at that same time, the villagers came out, took advantage of that, and 80% of those nests were collected and the eggs were transported to local villages for food source. By 1978, 30 years later, there were only 200 turtles nesting in that area compared to that 42,000 in a day found only 30 years earlier. So obviously humans taking such a huge number of those eggs, such a big percentage, was an example of overexploitation that affected this community of turtles. So, is it a success story? There's been a lot of effort in recent decades to protect sea turtles. There's been options of protecting nests, relocating nests in oil spills to try to protect the eggs, and also making parts of beaches not accessible to humans due to nesting areas. Legal protection where you can't take their eggs, you can't touch their nests, you can't be on the beach around them. You can't have lights on at night, things like that, because when those eggs do hatch, we want the turtles to head the right direction, and they usually head towards the moon over the ocean. And if they see a light, they can go the wrong way. With that, combined with a lot of research and education and legal protections, in 2009, this population has recovered decently, and they found over 20,000 nests in that same kind of land area that they had been looking at before. So sea turtles continue to struggle, though. There's a lot of challenges out there for them. Habitat loss and degradation, climate change, pollution, as I said before, light pollution causing babies to go the wrong way, solid waste in the water, chemical imbalances and stuff in their environment can all be a problem. Non-native vegetation, which leads to erosion of nesting areas. So when people kind of change the plants growing on those dunes to look pretty, they're making a big impact to the animal life that lives there. And then beach armoring, which is just a word for when we have bigger waves with climate change, we do things like seawalls and retaining walls. Well, guess what? That changes the shape and the formation and the function of the beach, which is very important for the population of sea turtles to continue year after year. Another impact of overexploitation is a result of the exotic pet trade. Exotic pets is basically a term for animals that are taken from the wild and that are not domesticated. So they haven't been genetically altered, they haven't been tamed, they still have the same kind of genetic information as the wild ones. Um, so this is a big business, $15 billion a year in the United States alone. Obviously, if you're going to be selling that many wildlife animals, it's going to have a negative impact on them and a negative impact on the ecosystems. We talked last lesson about the introduction of exotic species to the wild accidentally or intentionally when people's snakes get too big, can have negative effects on our own wildlife that isn't exotic. And also, by collecting so many wildlife for these pet trades, it can decline the populations in the wild of those exotic pets. Finding Nemo is a great example, or Losing Nemo is what we're calling it here, because this movie basically caused the clownfish to become overexploited. Already, clownfish were suffering a little bit. They depend on anemones for reproduction and protecting their eggs. However, because of bleaching and chemical alterations of the ocean and temperature increases, bleaching was already causing anemones to struggle and die. When that happens, the fish don't have places to reproduce and protect their eggs. However, the 2003 movie inspired people to add a Nemo to their tank. Basically, there was a captive breeding program, but there weren't enough for the sudden huge rise in demand. And as a result, in order to make the money while the market was there was a lot that were harvested illegally from the wild, and it has impacted the wild population of clownfish. Here is an example of a cute little monkey, the Margarita capuchin. Very critically endangered, less than 300 individuals in 2010. Reasons that these were struggling: habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, poaching for pest control. So these were considered pests, and therefore were being removed from the environment. They're also collected for the pet trade because they're pretty darn cute, and threatened by other primate species that were brought into that area because of as pets and then released into their natural environment. So again, if they were the only kind of monkey species there, they struggled with competition, with disease transmission, and then hybridization. They started mating with those animals that were brought in. So the purebred Margarita capuchins were mating with, for instance, the wedge-capped capuchins, and those hybridizations kind of is a mix of the two characteristics, but it takes away the unique characteristics of the individual species. So here we can see in the pet trade, they did a survey of primate pets in a certain area in Venezuela, and found these different types of monkeys all being pets there. And what they did find as well is that monkeys as pets are pretty darn good at escaping captivity, mixing with each other, and affecting those native environments as well. But you can see the top two types of monkeys that were pets were those two I just mentioned, the Margarita capuchin and the wedge-capped capuchin. I've never seen a macaw this color, probably because they're super rare, but these guys are an endangered species because they nest in cavities, in trees and things like that. With habitat loss, if their homes are gone, they have trouble finding a place to live, and they've been intensely poached for the pet trade because of their unique coloring. Um, Apparently, this guy who used to be a protector of birds pleaded guilty to smuggling tons of these same birds that he was claiming to protect, and many of them died during that process. So You got to be careful of those bird people. So, what can we do to deal with overexploitation? A huge thing that can happen is education. One thing that they saw was in 2007 in South Africa. I'm sorry, 2013 in South Africa, 1,004 were poached, whereas there were only 13 poached in 2007. Vietnam was the main country that was purchasing the horns from these rhinos. So what they did was they put a year-long education campaign in Vietnam, and they found that the demand for the product dropped a third in 1 year, and it decreased 38% people in actually buying it. And it decreased 25% of people no longer believed that it had a medicinal value. So obviously, education is a great place to start if you can rid people of the desire to purchase a product that helps reduce the buyers and therefore the exploitation. Another thing that we can do to deal with exploitation is enforcement. There's lots of different regulations, quotas, groups that are trying to enforce different rules about protecting animals and not exploiting them. Here we can see U.S. fisheries trying to rebuild fishing stocks and prevent overfishing and low fish numbers. Certification is an interesting concept. You can require groups or people, for instance, in the fishing industry, to be certified to do it right in a way that's sustainable and better for the environment. There's all kinds of certification programs for fisheries. Organizations have to meet certain criteria in order to be allowed to go out and fish legally. But there's a lot of greenwashing, which basically means an organization tries to look like they're doing things or claim or state that they are doing things in a way that's good for the environment, but it's not always the case. So they really need a lot of checks and balances in this kind of situation. And then research. If you're worried about overexploitation, should be aware of where products come from geographically. Research what types of products come from sustainable sources and try to buy things from that. And of course, decreasing demand is the only long lasting viable option. So go ahead and give up now on ivory products in your house, please. All right. So that is it for that lesson. This one, plus all of the ones posted, I believe it's lesson 6 through 10, might be 5 through 10, I'd have to look, are going to be on our test that you're taking this week. Good luck.